Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be joined by Hajar today to discuss a topic that I think is coming up more and more with all of the climate regulation that we're seeing. So, maybe before we dive into climate accounting and carbon footprinting, Hajar, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Mel. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Hajar Pourbafrani. I have a background in chemical engineering, and for the past 10 years, I've been working as a climate strategy consultant, supporting and helping clients, company in different stage of their climate journey, from accounting, emissions, scope one, scope two, scope three.
Yeah, what important work, especially as we're experiencing more and more of these extreme weather events all around the world. When we talk about a carbon footprint, there's lots of lingo that gets thrown around, but maybe to ground everybody, when we talk about those three different scopes, what are we talking about?
For corporate carbon accounting, we do have a standard that we refer to for the definition and also the methodology and also the assumption. So that's the good news. And I think it's great to set the scene first before going to the discussion today. So the standard is GHG protocol, Greenhouse Gas Emission Protocol, is an internationally recognized guideline which we refer to when it comes to carbon accounting. So GHG protocol defines a scope one as direct greenhouse gas emission that is coming from your the emission sources that you own them or you operate them. So a good example is burning natural gas at the facility, factory, or offices to generate heat.
Mhm.
And then we have a scope two. A scope two is indirect emission coming from specifically from the energy that the company purchase. That is electricity, steam, cooling, or heating energy. So it's very specific to the energy that you purchase, and we call it indirect emission because it's coming from upstream of the energy. So while you are not shoveling coal into furnaces to generate electricity, you are creating the demand for generating that electricity by keeping the lights on in your facility. So that's why we call it indirect emission, and that falls into your scope two. Then we have a scope three, which is the more complex one, and it's basically all the rest of indirect emissions, and it comes from your supply chain, both upstream and also downstream of your value chain. Upstream is raw material that you pay for, services that you pay for, employee commuting, and downstream is related to your product and services that you deliver. For example, use of sold product and end of life of the product that you as a company are manufacturing. So that is the definition for all the three scope.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I thank you for breaking those down for us. And I think what's really interesting is when we talk about scope three, so you kind of started to touch on it, and we're looking at that GHG protocol. It's broken down into easy for those of us that are in the space to digest. There's about 15 categories. So oftentimes we're talking about purchase goods and services, business travel, use of sold products, which is what you were talking about. And oftentimes that scope three is something we hear a lot about. So I've seen a statistic that said, generally speaking, scope three is 25 times greater than that direct and indirect operations emissions. So the scope one and scope two. Why is that? Why do we hear so much about scope three?
That is correct, Mal. And the main reason is because, as you mentioned, scope three. We hear a lot about scope three because the scope three is often the largest piece of the pie. And for many companies, as you mentioned, it accounts for majority of their total footprint, up to could be up to 90% of their total footprint. So that is one reason scope 3 get a lot of attention because has the largest impact in your footprint. But another reason is, as we mentioned, scope 3 is indirect emission. So it means it's happening in your supply chain. And supply chain, it could be massive for companies, for many companies. So it has a large coverage, and you don't have direct control on those emission sources because it's happening out of your company's wall and factories. So you don't have direct control on that, and it's happening in your supply chain. I would say because of those two main reasons, a scope 3 usually get a lot of attention. And maybe if you want to give an example for scope 3, we also usually say your scope 3 is your supplier's scope 1 and scope 2. That could add another layer of complexity to that because for example, if we consider delivering product into your sites, so you pay for delivering those product to be delivered to your site by hiring a third-party transportation company, and that third-party logistic company is operating truck to deliver those products to your site. So we are talking about burning diesel gas here. So because it sits in your supply chain, it's it's considered your scope 3, but for the transportation company, it's considered their scope 1 emission. So there is kind of this overlap between the reporting company and their supply chain for the same emission when we talk about a scope 3.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. One thing I have to ask is, does that mean that we're double counting? Are we over counting those emissions?
I'm really glad, Mel, you asked that question because it's one of the most common question I've been asked as a consultant when we start working with client for their scope 3. The short answer is no, there is no double counting because as per GG protocol, we're actually required to avoid double counting. So when we look at one single company's reporting boundary, um, one emission source is only reported under one of the scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. So, for example, if we again look at natural gas, you're burning natural gas, that is going to be reported on your scope 1. And it's strictly forbidden to report same natural gas under your scope 3. So, from a perspective of one single company, there is no overlap and there is no double counting. But when it comes to your value chain, same smoke is reported under different companies' inventory, and that there is an intention behind that. It's intended to be designed like that because that overlap put the liability in both the reporting company and the supplier. So they are both responsible for that emission. And if we think about it, the ultimate goal for carbon accounting is to reduce the emission. So by having this liability in both inventories, the supplier and also the factory come together to work together to reduce that emission. So if we look at the example of truck, so both the company that is receiving the material are delivered to its site, and also the logistic company, they have to work together to make that transportation process more efficient and also more cleaner. So that is kind of an intention to do that, to make sure that the supply chain have the relationship and come together to work on the relationship and work together to reduce that emission.
Yeah, I think that shared responsibility and the awareness, right? By doing the accounting, there's more visibility and transparency into what's going on. And it helps, to your point, to decarbonize or to think about where there's opportunities for reductions. And without the information, we're kind of shooting blindly. But if we have more of a understanding of what's going on, it's a little bit easier to think what our biggest levers are and where the actual largest emissions are coming from. So that is really clear. So I appreciate that. Now, when we think about regulation, there's a lot going on that's becoming required to report on. How is that shifting the footprinting methodology or kind of the approaches that companies are taking?
That's a very interesting question, and I would say that because I have seen a shift from, early in my career when I started working on carbon accounting, where the main driver was regulation, and regulations were targeting massive companies, large companies to report and disclose their carbon footprint. So, and it still is the main driver for those companies. For example, in the Europe, we see CSRD that is asking company that have a specific size and meet the threshold to disclose environmental metrics such as carbon numbers. I would say recently and in 2 days, that's my understanding that and my feeling that um, I think the biggest driver of carbon accounting today has shifted from regulation to supply chain itself. And by that I mean when once the regulation is targeting those massive, large multinational companies, often what we see is that those large companies, need the data for their scope 3, and they turn around to their suppliers and they ask for the numbers and for the data to be more supplier specific, to have more supplier specific data. And oftentimes, the supplier of these large companies are a small size, mid-sized companies that they do not have an obligation by law or by regulation to report or disclose, but they have been asked by their suppliers. And because these suppliers and the relationship between the suppliers are really important to them, they need to look into their emission and also start accounting and sharing those numbers. So I would say I have seen a shift from regulation itself being the driver, and nowadays the supply chain playing an important role for creating the demand for carbon accounting.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen that shift as well. Now, we've covered a lot of different places within the accounting world and the things that companies are being asked. It's a lot to digest, whether we're mature or immature on our climate journey. What do you suggest as a place for people to get started?
Definitely, Mel, I agree with you. It's a scope series specifically. It could sound very overwhelming when you talk about supply chain, when you talk about 15 categories being involved, and all different emission sources and all different type of data that you need to collect. So it's definitely overwhelming. And I have seen also the fear in the face of client who wanted to do this for the first time. And I would say a lot of time the fear comes from the feeling that they have. They think the data that they have is not perfect enough. It's not great enough to start the accounting. And what we have seen in reality is different. So, the data that you have has to be good enough to direct you to the right, to point you to the right direction. So the data that you collect and you have, it has to be good enough to point you to the right direction. And but often I also tell companies and clients is that you don't need a perfect inventory to start this journey. So this is a journey of carbon accounting, and you don't need the perfect data to start the accounting. You can start with whatever data you have. You can use a hybrid method for whatever supplier you have the best data, use the best data, and for the one you're missing, you can always use proxy and estimate to estimate this journey. So I know it sounds overwhelming, but it's more doable when you start.
I love the reassurance, and I would echo that doing something, even if it's not the most mature methodology, is a great place to start and to learn and to figure out where your business is at and how to obviously engage with your scope three, with your supply chain to better understand or to think about what kind of direction an organization can go in. I can't thank you enough for helping to break down climate accounting and carbon footprinting to the basics so more people can understand what we're talking about when we talk about those topics.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, I'm really glad we had this conversation, and I hope for the audience we were able to maybe shift the view from looking at a scope T as a complex task into something that is more manageable. And I hope it was helpful to have this discussion.